My grandfather went to medical school at McGill. There, he crossed paths with a guy named Norman Bethune. Before my grandfather died, he would share his opinion about Dr. Bethune with me. He was crazy, a communist embarrassment. Now, my grandfather was not wrong, but at the same time, my grandfather was completely wrong. In China, there are universities named after him, hospitals, a military medical college. The highest medical honor in the country bears his name. School children have memorized his story for over 80 years. Ask any Chinese person if they know Norman Bethune, and you'll get a polite, quiet, blank stare. But if you say, Bai Chu Yun, watch their faces change. That's a man who became a saint in someone else's country. His name means the light who pursues kindness. In Canada, we put him on a stamp eventually. This is the story of a man whose own country didn't know what to do with him. Brilliant, reckless, impossible, and probably the most consequential Canadian doctor who has ever lived. Norman Bethune was born in Gravenhurst, Ontario in 1890, the son of a preacher and the grandson of a surgeon. By the age of 8, he had already decided which one he wanted to be. He enrolled at the University of Toronto for medicine in 1912. One of his classmates was a quiet, methodical young man from Alliston, Ontario named Frederick Banting. Same class, same degree, both born in small Ontario towns, both dead at exactly 49. Banting would go on to co-discover insulin, win the Nobel Prize, and be celebrated as a national hero. The other would become the most famous Canadian most Canadians have never heard of. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. He was restless from the start. Medicine at U of T, interrupted by the First World War. He went to France as a stretcher bearer, got hit by shrapnel, came home, finished his degree, went back to Europe as a naval surgeon. The war shaped him. He had already seen what bodies look like when systems fail them. After he trained in Edinburgh, he got married, he traveled Europe. Then, in 1926, his body failed him. Tuberculosis, the same disease he spent his career learning to fight. He checked himself into a sanitarium in upstate New York. The prognosis was not good. Here is where Bethune becomes Bethune. He read everything he could to find out about tuberculosis treatment. He found a procedure, an artificial pneumothorax, collapsing the diseased lung to let it rest and heal. The medical staff thought it was too dangerous. He insisted. They eventually agreed. And it worked. Within weeks, he was recovering. Within months, he was out. He had stared at his own death and decided it owned him something. He moved to Montreal and talked his way into a fellowship under Dr. Edward Archibald at the Royal Victoria Hospital at McGill, one of the top thoracic surgery programs in the world. This is where my grandfather knew him. My grandfather went on to deliver thousands of Canadian babies over a long career as an obstetrician. He was a careful, respected man, and his considered opinion of the colleague he crossed paths with at McGill was crazy and a communist embarrassment. Dr. Archibald thought Bethune was, and I'm quoting here, quick but rough, not careful, far from neat, and just a little dangerous. Now this honestly tracks. Between 1928 and 1936, Bethune invented or redesigned more than a dozen surgical instruments. He published 14 papers. He performed hundreds of operations, including procedures no one in Canada had ever even attempted. He was probably the first surgeon in the world to do a bilateral thoracoplasty. He was doing things. He was also picking fights at every dinner party in Montreal, showing up late, showing up drunk, and loudly telling people who would listen that the Canadian medical system was leaving poor people to die. That last part was not wrong either. Archibald fired him in 1933. He landed at Hôpital de Sacré-Cœur just outside the city and kept operating. But something had shifted. The fights, the drinking, the TB ward. He just started doing the math on who got to live and who didn't. And the answer is, as he put it, was simple. The rich man recovers and the poor man dies. He joined the Communist Party of Canada in 1935. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Franco's fascists on one side, the elected Republican government on the other, so Bethune got on a boat. He arrived in Madrid with no real plan except to help. What he found was soldiers bleeding out on the way to the hospital, dying not from their wounds, but from blood loss during transport. The hospitals were too far. The blood wasn't getting there in time. So he invented the solution. He organized the world's first mobile blood transfusion unit, a truck, refrigerated blood, drove it to the front lines. He performed transfusions in the field where the soldiers had fallen. He processed thousands of donations, built a supply chain from scratch under heavy artillery, and saved a number of lives that no one has ever fully counted. Meanwhile, Canadians had no idea about his heroics. He came home from Spain in 1937 to raise money and awareness for the Loyalist cause. Canada was politely uninterested. He was a communist, and that made people uncomfortable. Fine, so he left again. This time for China, where Mao Zedong's 8th Route Army was fighting the Japanese invasion and had almost no medical infrastructure. Bethune showed up with a medical team, set up a mobile surgical unit, and started operating. The conditions were almost beyond description. He performed surgery in caves, in temples, in abandoned farmhouses, in the dark, in the cold, in the middle of firefights. He trained Chinese medics from nothing. He built a medical school. He performed, by some accounts, over 1,000 battlefield operations in less than 2 years. He just never stopped. In November 1939, Bethune was operating in the field. His scalpel slipped. He cut his own finger. In an era before surgical gloves, before universal precautions, a cut like this is certainly a death sentence. The infection spread. He developed sepsis, but he kept on operating. He died on November 12, 1939, in a village in Hebei province. He was only 49 years old. He'd been in China for less than 2 years. Mao Zedong wrote his eulogy personally. It was titled In Memory of Norman Bethune, and it was mandatory reading for every member of the Chinese Communist Party. Billions have read this. In Canada, the obituaries were modest at best. A communist died, some said. Embarrassment, said the others. In 1990, Canada finally made a movie about Bethune, the most expensive Canadian film ever produced at that time. They got Donald Sutherland to play him, one of the greatest Canadian actors who's ever lived, a man who had been lobbying to make this film for over a decade. Helen Mirren played his wife. They shot it in China with the real 8th Route Army as extras. It flopped at the box office. Of course it did. He's still a communist. People were uncomfortable. Sutherland passed away in 2024, and he had spent over a decade trying to get this film made. He understood something that most Canadians didn't, that Bethune wasn't really a communist or a doctor or a hero. He was just a man who couldn't look away from suffering. And that's a hard thing to make a movie about, but it's also a hard thing to argue with. Canada eventually came around. In 1972, the federal government declared him a person of national historical significance. There's a statue in Montreal, a memorial home in Gravenhurst, his name on a college at York University. In China, there are hospitals and universities and the highest medical honor in the country. He has been a national hero there for 85 years and counting. Now, my grandfather was a careful man, a conventional man. He helped bring thousands of Canadians into this world as an obstetrician. He built a good life, he practiced good medicine, he kept his head down, and he came home at night. He looked at Norman Bethune and saw chaos, scandal, a man who couldn't leave well enough alone. He wasn't wrong. Whether crazy or communist embarrassment, he was also the only foreigner in history to become a national hero in China. Depending on your definition of embarrassing, that's actually pretty Canadian. This is north of famous. What's your excuse?